45 years after the crime, a 79-year-old man is wheeled into a Texas courtroom. He is frail and gray. If you did not know why he was there, you might even feel sorry for him. The case he is answering for began on a cold January night when a young nursing student walked down a quiet Austin street and never reached her friend's front door. That student was 25-year-old Susan Leigh Wolfe. Tonight on True Crime Animator Studio, we walk with Susan Leigh Wolfe on that last night. We watch the investigation freeze for decades. We see it revived by one forensic breakthrough that finally answered the question her family had been asking since 1980. Who killed Susan Leigh Wolfe? Welcome to True Crime Animator Studio. My name is Tim B, and this elegant little legend next to me is my co-host Zeus, my sphynx cat. I love this guy. He has been with me through many of these stories, and when he chimes in, it is usually to voice the question you are already asking in your head. This episode involves violence against a young woman, but there will be no graphic detail. Please take care of yourself while you watch. Let's go back to January 9th, 1980. It is the first day of classes at the University of Texas at Austin School of Nursing. For 25-year-old Susan Leigh Wolfe, it is the start of a new life. Susan Leigh Wolfe has enrolled in the program, and people who knew her remember her as smart, determined, kind, and excited about the future she is building. That same day, Susan Leigh Wolfe's apartment is sprayed for bugs. The fumes make it unsafe to sleep there, so she arranges to stay at a friend's place a few blocks away. Late that evening, around 10 o'clock, Susan Leigh Wolfe locks her door, steps into the winter air, and starts walking through her neighborhood toward her friend's house. She never arrives. A witness later tells police what he saw. That witness is a young mechanic we will call 1980 Eyewitness Mark Henson. 1980 Eyewitness Mark Henson says he watched a car ease up alongside Susan Leigh Wolfe. The driver gets out, grabs her in what he describes as a bear hug, pulls a coat over her head, and forces her into the car. The passenger door opens too, but from where 1980 Eyewitness Mark Henson is standing, he cannot see clearly what the second person does. Because 1980 Eyewitness Mark Henson works in the automotive industry, something else sticks in his mind: the car. He tells investigators he is sure it is a two-door 1970 Dodge Polara. Old even then. Damaged. The kind of detail a mechanic notices and does not forget. In a matter of seconds, Susan Leigh Wolfe is gone. There is no call for help, no chance to run, just a quiet street, a stranger's car, and a kidnapping that no one knows is happening until it is already over. The next morning, January 10th, 1980, police are called to an alley off East 17th Street in Austin. There, officers find the body of Susan Leigh Wolfe. She has been a victim of SA. There are signs she has been strangled. She has been shot in the head. Her death is ruled a homicide. Austin detectives treat it as an urgent case. In the first year, investigators interview 1980 Eyewitness Mark Henson and chase down cars that match the Dodge Polara. They build a list of more than 40 people of interest and even interview suspects as far away as New York. But every lead collapses. Every promising name hits a dead end. What does not fade is the evidence collected from Susan Leigh Wolfe's body. Pathologists document everything carefully. Crucial biological evidence from the assault is preserved and kept by the Austin Police Department and the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab, where people like forensic scientist Dr. Elena Ruiz will later work. Witnesses move. Memories blur. The city changes. Margaret Wolfe, a family member of Susan Leigh Wolfe, grows older along with the rest of the family, carrying grief with no answer. Detectives retire. New investigators inherit the file, work it, and hand it off again. Let me pause the story here and bring us back to the office, because this is where cold case work is both heartbreaking and hopeful. If the file and the evidence were there the whole time, what actually changes a case from unsolved to solvable? For decades, the file on Susan Leigh Wolfe sits on a shelf labeled unsolved, but the autopsy evidence does not disappear. It moves from one evidence room to another as the years go by and the science quietly evolves around it. In 1980, there is no DNA profiling in criminal investigations. Even years later, many labs cannot do much with tiny or degraded samples. Over the last 20 years, forensic science changes dramatically. Techniques improve, databases grow. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, becomes one of the most powerful tools in modern policing for linking crimes and offenders. None of that brings someone back, but it can turn a case from impossible into solvable. The key is that someone has to go back to that old box, pull the evidence out, and ask, can we do more with this now than we could back then? In the case of Susan Leigh Wolfe, that someone is Detective Joe Jedynak in the Austin Police Cold Case Homicide Unit. In 2023, Detective Joe Jedynak decides it is time to try again. On April 27, 2023, Detective Joe Jedynak submits the preserved evidence related to the sexual assault in Susan Leigh Wolfe's case to the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab. There, forensic scientist Dr. Elena Ruiz and her team examine the material and decide there is enough for modern DNA testing. By February 2024, forensic scientist Dr. Elena Ruiz and her colleagues have developed a male DNA profile from that evidence. That profile is run through CODIS, the national database that compares DNA from crime scenes with profiles from convicted offenders and other investigations. On March 11, 2024, Detective Joe Jedynak and his team get the notification they have been waiting decades to see. CODIS has a hit. The possible contributor to the DNA found in Susan Leigh Wolfe's case is identified as 78-year-old Deck Brewer Jr., a white man already incarcerated in Massachusetts on an unrelated conviction. Now the cold case team has a name, Deck Brewer Jr., but a name alone is not enough. Investigators obtain a search warrant to collect a fresh DNA sample directly from Deck Brewer Jr. In July 2024, Detective Joe Jedynak and other officers travel to Massachusetts, serve the warrant, and sit down for a short interview with Deck Brewer Jr. According to police, Deck Brewer Jr. admits he had been in Austin and San Antonio around the time of the murder of Susan Leigh Wolfe. When detectives tell him that his DNA has been found in evidence from a homicide, Deck Brewer Jr. invokes his right to a lawyer. The conversation stops. Back in Texas, the fresh DNA sample from Deck Brewer Jr. is compared with the old evidence from Susan Leigh Wolfe's autopsy. The match is overwhelming. Lab reports say that the chance of a random, unrelated person being the source of that DNA is unimaginably small. On August 14, 2024, based on the totality of the evidence, a judge in Austin issues an arrest warrant charging Deck Brewer Jr. with the murder of Susan Leigh Wolfe. Deck Brewer Jr. is eventually extradited to Texas and formally indicted. Even then, the case is not completely closed. 1,980 Eyewitness Mark Henson originally saw a driver and a passenger in that Dodge Polara. The DNA evidence links Deck Brewer Jr. to the assault and murder, but it does not identify the second man in the car. Detectives say that part of the investigation is still open. Fast forward to November 2025. In a Travis County courtroom, now 79-year-old Deck Brewer Jr. appears before Judge Michael Ramirez in a wheelchair. In the gallery, Margaret Wolfe watches as the man linked to the killing of Susan Leigh Wolfe faces the court more than 45 years later. Prosecutor Angela Torres stands for the state. Prosecutor Angela Torres presents the plea agreement and explains how work by Detective Joe Jedynak and forensic scientist Dr. Elena Ruiz finally connected Deck Brewer Jr. to the murder of Susan Leigh Wolfe. Deck Brewer Jr. pleads guilty to murder for the death of Susan Leigh Wolfe. A separate capital murder charge is waived as part of the plea agreement. Judge Michael Ramirez sentences Deck Brewer Jr. to 8 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Because Deck Brewer Jr. has already served time in Massachusetts for a different case, that time is credited toward his Texas sentence. In practical terms, Deck Brewer Jr. may serve less than the full 8 years behind bars in Texas. Back here at the desk with Zeus, for people hearing this for the first time, that number can sound shockingly low. Susan Leigh Wolfe was kidnapped off the street, assaulted, strangled, and shot. And the person who admits to killing her receives 8 years. On paper, that is 8 years. To Margaret Wolfe and the rest of Susan Leigh Wolfe's family, it probably feels like 8 minutes. How is that even considered justice? Witnesses like 1,980 Eyewitness Mark Henson are older. Some people are gone. Memories are fragile. Some evidence is no longer available. Prosecutor Angela Torres and her team have to weigh the risk of a full trial and the possibility of no conviction against the certainty of a guilty plea, a conviction for the murder of Susan Leigh Wolfe, and an admission on the record by Deck Brewer Jr. For Susan Leigh Wolfe's family, it is not satisfying. But they do get something they never had before. An official answer to the question, who did this? In statements to the public, a police spokesperson we will call Captain Lisa Morales says the conviction shows the value of preserving evidence and revisiting old cases. Captain Lisa Morales and the Cold Case Homicide Unit hold it up as an example of their commitment to making sure victims' voices are not silenced by time. When we talk about true crime, it is easy to focus on the twist, the DNA hit, the courtroom moment, the mugshot of Deck Brewer Jr. But at the center of this story is a woman who was walking to a friend's house after her first day of nursing school. Susan Leigh Wolfe had taken the risk of going back to school. of investing in a future that would let her care for other people. Her life was cut short in a way that was brutal and undeserved. For 45 years, the people who loved Susan Leigh Wolfe had to live with a story that stopped in an alley on East 17th Street. Cold case work does not erase that. Forensic science cannot undo what happened, but it can bring clarity where there was only uncertainty and accountability where there had been a void. If you take one thing away from the story of Susan Leigh Wolfe, let it be this: the way we handle evidence, the way we fund labs, and the way we prioritize unsolved cases matters. It matters to families like Margaret Wolfe's, who are still waiting for a knock at the door. It matters to communities who want to know if someone dangerous is still out there. It matters to the memory of people like Susan Leigh Wolfe, whose lives were much more than the worst thing that ever happened to them. Thank you for watching this episode of True Crime Animator Studio. If the case of Susan Leigh Wolfe moved you or taught you something new, please tap like, subscribe to TCAS, and turn on notifications so you do not miss future deep dives. I would love to hear your thoughts and your own experiences with cold cases in the comments below. And remember, one carefully stored box of evidence can still speak louder than 45 years of silence. If people like Detective Joe Jedynak, forensic scientist Dr. Elena Ruiz, and Captain Lisa Morales care enough to open it, take care of yourself, and I will see you soon. Bye.